I found the video on a Tuesday morning while I was standing in the narrow hallway of Auntie's small duplex, the smell of coffee and lemon-scented detergent still clinging to the air from the late-night dishes I'd cleaned for them the night before. I had come over because Auntie, short for Antonella, though she preferred the nickname since high school, had asked for help. Her car was dead, her landlord was breathing down her neck about a leak, and her little boy had slept through the night for the first time in weeks. I'd learned the rhythm of helping her over the years, fixing leaky faucets, babysitting, picking up groceries, sitting on the sagging sofa while she cried about being underpaid at the day job, because she was family by affection if not by blood, because she'd once driven me through a blizzard when my car was a husk, because our lives had braided in small, practical ways that felt like loyalty. I was scrolling through her phone to find the directions to the parts store when a thumbnail flashed, a 3-second vertical clip shot from the angle of a kitchen doorway, audio soft and muffled but unmistakable. For half a beat, I thought it was some silly viral thing. Then I watched my mother's face, in her faded cardigan, and her hair in that careless knot she took to in the evenings. And I felt the breath leave me. She was leaning on a counter I knew, the one with a nick in the varnish from a pan she'd dropped 5 years ago, hands clasped around a mug, talking to someone off camera. Auntie's voice floated in from out of frame, nervous and fast. Then my mother said, clear as a bell in that small, unguarded way she sometimes had, "There's such a cow, always doing everything, always hoping for a thank you that never comes." She laughed, low, private, and the laugh sliced through me because I had been the one who'd spent the previous night coaxing Auntie's son to sleep, who had been the one to drive Auntie to a clinic when her cough got worse, who had been the one picking up extra shifts at the cafe to cover rent so neither of us had to call our parents. The word cow in her mouth landed heavier than any insult, because it felt like a verdict from a court where I'd never been summoned. It wasn't just name-calling. It was the erasure of care, the trimming away of empathy that should have been a family's first law. Auntie's apology text to me pinged as I set the phone gently on the table. Sorry, oh my God, I didn't mean to. I thought it was a text to my sister. I'm so sorry." Her hands were shaking. Hers had filmed the video by accident. She said, meant to send it to someone else, a friend who made jokes about family, not realizing the camera had caught my mother's whole line, not realizing that this version of my mother existed, the one who could call me their cow, as Namway. If I were a piece of livestock and not a person who learned to braid my brother's hair and to read statements for hours until the numbers made sense. The room hummed with the electricity of betrayal, but the thing about betrayal is that it is never a single flash. It is a kind of slow weathering that, once noticed, organizes everything that came before into a new map of meaning. In the weeks that followed, the tiny accidents and slights rearranged themselves. The holidays that used to taste like cinnamon and neutral forgiveness now tasted like an afterword I hadn't been asked to read. Old favors, driving mom to the doctor, paying for the utilities when she got behind, the texts at midnight listening to her rehearsal for job interviews, turned into self-evident absurdities as if I'd been a volunteer in a play in which the script had never been shared with me. I began absurdly and then with grim method to collect proof. Photos of mom's messages that contradicted what she said in person, overheard remarks at family gatherings where she mimicked me in a way that made others laugh, a voicemail where, when she didn't know I would see it, she complained about a people who make everything an obligation. Each piece fit together into a pattern, and lo and behold, patterns make it harder to keep on pretending that everything is random. I confronted her the first time with tenderness and a sting. "Did you call me that?" I asked because I needed the witnessing of the question even as I dreaded the answer. Her eyes flickered like an animal's caught in headlights. She apologized in that automatic, practiced way that does not require much of the conscience. "I was frustrated," she said. "It came out wrong." She told me that she loved me. She offered to come over the next week for dinner. I wanted to believe her, but the footage in Auntie's phone had the quality of truth that sentences which are spoken casually cannot. It was a moment that did not belong to the narrative she gave me afterwards. It existed independently. I kept thinking about the scene itself. The softness of her voice as if she was humoring someone dangerous. The casual cruelty that had crept in from a life of unmet expectations. My mother had never been purely villain or saint. She was a collage of survival tactics learned in an economy that told her women should be grateful, of marriages dissolved and mortgages aborted in a childhood of being required to be the good one. Her cruelty was not simply malice, it was also the reverberation of a small, tired heart. I knew because I had been on both sides that family dynamics are often scaffolding made out of scavenged materials anger, duty, fear, held together with fragile patience. And yet the anger I felt at being called a cow, at being minimized, at being treated as a default receiver of labor burned like a fault line. I started to change the way I showed up. Where once I had offered my time as if it were inexhaustible, I began to set boundaries that felt like new muscles, awkward and efficient. When Mom asked me to run errands for her, I asked what she would do if I couldn't. When she expected me to disrupt my life on the flick of a message, I set my phone down and let the calls ring. At first she didn't notice, which was its own wound. How could someone ignore the sudden absence of another person unless they had been taking them for granted all along? Then she tried guilt. She called it midnight. She sent group messages complaining about how kids these days were so self-absorbed. She played the victim, and people responded with the ancient social instinct to mediate. The family rallied around rituals that never seemed to include me. Birthday dinner for Aunt Carla that I found out about the day before. A graduation brunch announced on social media, but not on the group chat. It stung, and I cataloged the stings with the clinical precision of someone trying to make a case out of a life. Auntie and I became confidants in a new way. She admitted that she had, in the past, sometimes patched my mother's mood with small flattery. An act of omission she now regretted. Wanted peace. She told me once, flicking crumbs from her sweater, I didn't want to make things worse. Sometimes it felt easier to laugh. The video then was a mirror held up too close. The laugh had a sound I couldn't abide because the person laughing had weaponized my giving into a private joke. I thought of revenge, not the melodramatic movies kind, but the quiet redress of dignity. I wanted the people who had made me the backdrop of their lives to see me as I saw myself. A person with limits and a life. So I started in small, lawful ways. I wrote an email once to the family group describing boundaries, not naming names, an open, honest note about labor and reciprocity, about how care that flows in only one direction becomes coercion. I attached a link to resources about emotional labor and the cultural expectation that women must mother without comment. I tried to be constructive, not punitive, and in return the family offered a spectrum of responses, from sheepish apologies to irritation at my public airing. There were, though, people who read my message and reached out. Cousins I hadn't heard from in years offered coffee, neighbors offered kind words, some friendships deepened and some fell away like dead leaves. Then there were discoveries I hadn't expected. In the small-town grocery where my mother had worked years before she married, an old coworker told me stories of how she had covered shifts for my mother and had been rewarded with entitlement rather than thanks. A neighbor admitted they had heard my mother call me their cow more than once, in tones of exasperation when I declined to run late-night errands. The evidence assembled itself like a mosaic. The more I learned, the less I wanted to perform the kind of revenge that would humiliate. Exposing every private cruelty to the world felt like it would only cement me as the person who retaliated, the angry child. Instead, I tried to shift the narrative gently but firmly. I refused to be available on demand. I invested in my life outside the gravitational pull of my family's expectations. I reconnected with the friends and lovers and small pleasures that reminded me I was more than a service. Sometimes, though, the old habits of wanting acknowledgement returned like storms you can't predict. I would call my mother, and after 5 minutes we would fall into the old roles where I was the listener, and she the director, doling out tasks and then resuming astonishment when I asked consideration. There were nights I fantasized about a more cinematic revenge, projecting the video at a family reunion, letting the room go still and watching the hierarchy rearrange itself. But those imaginings felt like a child's promise to themselves, satisfying in imagination and terrible in practice. When my mother's health declined, small things at first, missed appointments, a faintness in her step. Compassion complicated everything. I became the person who argued with myself about whether caring for parents who had been hurtful made one noble or merely trapped. Auntie's role in all of this was complicated too. She felt guilt for having filmed the clip. She felt guilt for having laughed with my mother. She felt guilt for the ways that neighborhoods and small towns make people collude and survive. We both learned together that honesty may not repair everything, but it can build something sturdier than denial. One winter morning, after a long night of snow and small resentments, I sat with my mother at the kitchen table and told her, in sentences that felt like surgery, what the video had done to me. I did not raise my voice. I named specifics. I told her that when she called me a cow, I heard the message that my work is the default and that my existence could be measured in tasks. She looked at me. For once, she did not look away. I didn't mean to hurt you, she said. I didn't mean it like. It was not a full confession. People rarely give those willingly, but it was a start. We made a brittle agreement, fewer last-minute asks, texts instead of calls for favors, payment offered for things I would otherwise have done for free. I insisted on being paid for time I donated. Money, yes, but also recognition. A slip of paper with dollars exchanged hands in a way that felt simultaneously absurd and right. The change was incremental. My mother sometimes failed to meet the new terms. Sometimes she remembered. Often the pattern bent but did not break entirely. And yet over months, as the rancor dulled into a workable wariness, I realized something else. The urge to revenge had been a symptom of a deeper hunger, to be seen, to be respected, to be acknowledged as an agent with worth that did not depend on my labor. Revenge, it turned out, was not the primary currency I craved. The truer victory was reclaiming myself from the automatic scripts I'd been given. I stopped turning up when it suited other people, and I turned up instead for the life I wanted to live. Sometimes that meant leaving the room when a family gathering soured, and other times it meant staying and saying the hard thing. It meant, too, learning to accept that not every wound would be acknowledged or healed. Some grudges in families become an ongoing background hum, a radio station you learn to live with. The last time Auntie and I watched the clip, months later, we did it together with a new sense of distance. The old private laugh sounded smaller now, a human sound wobbling under the weight of choices. "I'm sorry," she said again, and we both meant it in ways that could not be collapsed into a single apology. We agreed in the quiet after to make new rules between us. If one of us ever captured something private again, we'd discuss before making it a joke. We wrote that rule down on a sticky note and stuck it to the fridge. That small piece of paper felt like an oath. The story that began with an accidental video ended not with a dramatic unmasking or a triumphant public ruin of my mother, though there were moments that thanked me with apologies, but with the hard and ordinary labor of boundary setting, of reallocating emotional labor to make space for reciprocity. I stopped keeping score in the old way and started keeping it in the new way, with frank conversations, with money where money was due, with time given when it was freely offered, and with the permission to say no without apology. The temptation to craft a revenge narrative, neat poetic collapse of the person who hurt you, remained a seductive alley I sometimes walked down in my head. But revenge, I discovered more often than not, leaves parts of you stained with the thing you sought to punish. The real remedy was simpler and quieter: to become the person whose boundaries were visible and whose care was not taken for granted. In that way, I reclaimed my dignity without having to humiliate anyone else. My mother and I never returned to the old seamlessness. We settled into a new, imperfect choreography where tenderness and distance moved across the floor like dancers who had learned new steps. Auntie and I kept helping one another, but differently, by asking before acting, by paying for meals sometimes, by calling to check in rather than assuming availability. The accidental video remained a marker, an event that cracked open the house and let in light and air and a new way of being. I kept it, not as evidence for a trial, but as a memory of how I learned to stop carrying everyone's needs like a default burden on my back. I learned, finally, that the most effective revenge against being treated like a thing is not to strike back, but to stop consenting to the role. and that in the pause between the old and the new, you might find, unexpectedly, a kind of peace.